Good evening, and welcome to Woman. Why do people take drugs? Why, more importantly, do middle-class women, with most of the advantages of our affluent society, take drugs? My guest, Barbara Kerr, has some insights into these questions. In her book, Strong at the Broken Places, are 6 highly individual, candid, and revealing stories of women who tell what it's like to face the good and bad sides of American society, eventually coming to grips with their own pains and addictions. Barbara is a journalist from Chicago. Barbara, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sandy.
Can you tell me how you came to write this book?
Well, it's not a terribly exciting story. I felt, as I think so many women do today, a certain debt to the feminist movement, to the women who've done so much to make life easier for the particular kind of woman that I happen to be and that I assume you are by virtue of your profession. But in my years of professionalism in Chicago and Los Angeles, in the Midwest, I could not help but notice that immense numbers of middle-class women were taking drugs, and they were taking them habitually, day to day. And I wanted to find out, in part, why they turned to drugs, but even more importantly, how they resolved the problems that led them into drug use in the first place. And so that's what the book is really about. It's about middle-class women and their psychological problems, their desperate solutions, among which we find drugs, and their resolution.
Tell me a little bit about how you gathered the material for the book.
Haphazardly. I sent word out through friends in drug programs and Alcoholics Anonymous groups. I contacted psychologists and psychiatrists who gave me names of patients, of acquaintances. But I found that after the first month, it was not a question of my seeking out women. Women started coming to me. And after the first 6 months, it became almost impossible for me to go out socially without meeting at least one woman who wanted to talk to me about her drug-taking career.
Can you define the kind of addict that you're talking about in the book?
Yes, and it's important to do so because I really believe that women take drugs for different reasons than men do, and that adults take them for different reasons than children, and that middle-class people take them for different reasons than disadvantaged or upper-class people. And what I wanted to talk about here was a specific incidence, and that's the middle-class woman who is likely to be well-educated, who at least went to college or had the opportunity to go to college, though she may have chose not to, who came from what we recognize as the distinctly advantaged sector of society, the 2-parent household, the professional father or one at least minimally successful in business, and a mother that stayed at home and took care of the children. And I found that, as I think the book points out, that quite possibly proportionally and in absolute numbers, there are more habituated drug takers among middle-class women than in any other sector of society.
What kind of drugs are you talking about?
I'm talking about any mind-altering drug, be it legal or illegal.
What do you mean by legal drug?
By legal drug, I mean those that are commonly prescribed by a physician. Barbiturates, tranquilizers, and amphetamines.
Diet pills?
Diet pills, which are amphetamines. And I also include alcohol. I did not know when I began research for the book that I would include alcohol, but it quickly became obvious that drug-taking behavior is indistinguishable. I mean, once a person becomes habituated to drugs, it doesn't matter whether they're drinking alcohol, beer, or bourbon, or whether they're taking legal drugs or whether they're taking illegal drugs like heroin or cocaine. The effects are essentially the same.
Can you describe some of the effects of some of these drugs? Like, say, the hallucinogens first?
Well, I think you have to draw a distinction, and I do so in the book, between casual recreational drug use or drugs that are taken for a short-term problem in mood.
Mm-hmm.
You have to distinguish between that kind of drug taking and habitual drug taking, which is generally done on a daily basis, or which is something a woman turns to in any time of stress, be it for a period of 2 years or 20 years. I found that the effects of drugs, strangely enough, once you reach the habituated state, are all the same.
No matter what drug you're taking?
No, in a certain limited way, you can postulate that amphetamines will produce an animated state, an increase in metabolism, more, quote, energy or feelings of goodwill, while the narcotics or the barbiturates will calm you down. But there's such a thing as a paradoxical reaction in which an individual will take a drug that you expect to speed them up and it will in fact calm them down. But psychologically speaking, and that's what I think we have to talk about drugs. I don't think it does any good to talk about this, the specific pharmacology of drugs. I think we have to talk about the psychological states they induce. And I found that no matter what the drug was, whether it was alcohol or tranquilizers or marijuana or hallucinogens or heroin, if it was taken on a day-to-day basis, it was taken to deaden feeling. That unlike the casual use, which is to intensify feelings, it is without exception to deaden unpleasant feelings. And it produces a psychological state much like Novocaine. I mean, it really deadens your emotions so that in fact, while a drug-dependent person may feel better than they've ever felt in their life, what they're really feeling is the absence of negative feelings rather than the presence of positive ones.
What is coasting?
Coasting?
Yes.
Well, coasting is another term for nodding out, which is popular in the drug culture. It's when you've taken enough drug that you get a good feeling, and for the moment at least you don't need another drug.
What about strung out?
That again is a subculture term, and it means to be dependent on drugs. It means that if you find yourself without a drug, the drug of your choice, that you're going to feel very bad. And interestingly enough, however, I found that people generally had a drug they preferred, a drug that worked for them. That is, that it produced the feelings that they were seeking. But that if for any reason they could not obtain the drug of their choice, they would then switch to a different kind of drug. And it was at that point that middle-class women who had formerly held the belief that illegal drugs were somehow wrong, but that alcohol or legal drugs were somehow right, that was at that time, if they could not obtain a legal drug, they could very quickly make the transition to illegal drugs. They did not set out to become criminals or to define themselves as criminals, but if they could not get the drug that they wanted, then they would make that jump to the illegal drug world.
Do you feel that drug dependency is indicative of mental illness?
I think that people who take drugs have got to take the responsibility for their own actions. I think to talk about insanity is quite often a cop-out, and it's a way we have of putting the responsibility in the other world, the netherworld of madness. When in fact, what small amount of testing has been done among the addicted population, the narcotic addict and the alcoholic. They find no higher an incidence of abnormal personality than they do in the normal population. That is to say, they do not test out as overly schizophrenic or manic depressive or any of our known categories of mental illness. That the addict and the alcoholic population are as mentally healthy as the normal population.
I'm curious about one thing. I'm curious to know how the women you interviewed for the book fit the usual description we have of a drug-dependent person.
Well, they don't. They don't. Our literature is filled with drug takers who are either young, from the disadvantaged class, or male. There's been almost no research devoted to the female drug taker, the adult drug taker, and the middle-class drug taker. But that's what I was studying, and consequently, most of my findings run counter to the established literature. An example is that of every 100 addicts, only 1 or 2 will ever, quote, get straight. Well, that may well be true for the disadvantaged class. It is not true for the middle class. I found numbers of women who had had heroin habits, heavy heroin habits, that for periods of 2, 3, 4 years, who left their drug taking behind in much the way that middle class women tend to leave things behind when they no longer work for them. So I found middle class addicts, middle class women addicts, are not at all like the stereotype of the addict that we've come to, the myth that we've come to believe in.
Do they have anything in common?
Well, there's a deprivation there, you know, it's just that the deprivation is more likely to have been emotional rather than social or economic. As I said, these women come from the advantaged sector of society, and that's economically and socially. But there are very real questions about the emotional deprivation they all suffered as children.
You say in the book that there are two kinds of drug-dependent women. I'd like you to go into that a little bit. I found it really interesting.
Well, you can generalize to the extent of what I call the private drug taker and the public drug taker. The private drug taker is a housewife quite often, married, a mother quite often, who does not disaffect from the middle class, but who tries very hard to live out the myth of the middle class woman. She takes drugs, generally of the legal nature, either from her physician or from a number of physicians that she will, have gathered together, or she drinks. Barbiturates and booze is probably the most popular combination among middle class women. And this woman doesn't talk about her drugs because she's ashamed of it, and she knows that she takes drugs because she's having a problem of some sort. Quite often it's that her life is not fulfilling, it is not happy the way the dream said it was going to be, the myth of the middle class woman. But the woman that I write about is a public drug taker. She's a woman who comes from the middle class. Her origins are decidedly middle class. After she stops taking drugs, she will revert very much to the middle class. But during the period of her drug taking, she disaffects almost entirely from the middle class and displays a great deal of hostility toward the straight world. It can be a deviant subculture of alcohol, where she joins the bar society, or it can be one of drugs, where she moved to Los Angeles or Chicago or New York at one of the centers where we have a lot of primarily youthful drug taking.
Can you describe the adolescence of these women, the sort of middle-class upbringing that they've had? I found that very startling.
Well, they're the kind of women that you would expect good things to happen to. They're not the sort of women that you would think would be driven to drug addiction or alcoholism. Of the 6 women that I talked to, 5 were Girl Scouts. They all did very well in school. They were reasonably bright. They were attractive women. Their health was good. They were popular within the framework of having a lot of friends and being invited out to places. I found that the commonality they shared began perhaps in the home and began in a feeling of uniqueness that they all had about themselves. The belief from a very early age that there was something wrong with them, that they were cut off from a female experience that other women shared, but there was something distinctly unique about them. And it was, these feelings of weirdness, of strangeness, were pretty much under control until the time came when they were expected to make the transition from middle-class children to middle-class women. And it was at the time when they should have been expected to marry and to begin families that each of them broke and ran, disaffected entirely from the middle class. And I think in large part this has to do with the sort of families they came from, in particular the kind of mothers they had.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how did they feel about their mothers? I'm confused about that.
Well, they all cared very much for their mothers. I think that the love of their mothers, the respect or the approval, was very important to them. But at the same time, they wanted more than anything not to grow up to be like their mothers, because they saw from an early age that their mothers were not happy women. And as a child, you look at your role model, and it's generally your mother, and you see that she's unhappy, frustrated, disappointed, and the natural connection to make is that I don't want to grow up to be like this woman. I don't want to be a wife and a mother because this has clearly been so unrewarding, and it has caused pain to a woman that I love, to my mother. And I think it's borne out by the fact that during the years of their drug dependency, and some of them were strung out for 20 years, they paraded their drug taking in front of everyone except their mothers. And to their mothers, they maintained elaborate facades of happiness, a pretense that their lives were going much better than they really were.
How do you account for this feeling of their feeling of being different?
I think, in a sense, they are different. That is to say, they are forceful women, aggressive, competitive, unfocused, unfortunately, and with nothing to do with the forcefulness or the aggression except sort of turn it on themselves and turn it against the people around them. But it was reinforced by the problems with their mothers and by the fact that none of them received any encouragement to grow up to assume an identity as anything except just a woman. I think one of the most interesting questions I asked was, what do you want to be? What did you want to be when you grew up? And all of the women would look at me very negatively, and they'd say, well, I just wanted to be a woman, you know, whatever that might be, just a woman. And so then I would follow, and I'd say, well, did you want to be like your mother? And that's when they would get very vehement. And they would say, no, my mother was weak, my mother was pushy, my mother was unhappy, a variety of negative terms, which didn't conceal the real love that they had for their mothers. It just simply characterized the strong despair they had at their mothers' lives.
How do you feel they coped with their uniqueness? I mean, in a sense, they went from, you know, one culture to a subculture, and, you know, in that subculture sought the approval of their peers also. I mean,
at that time, I mean, people who take drugs tend to think that it's a very unique lifestyle, but it's not. And they did exactly what you've said they did. They sought out like-minded people. I mean, they disaffected from a middle class that had failed them. They rejected the roles that they believed they could not live up to. But because, you know, women need support, people need support, and you look for like-minded people. And where they found the most acceptance was in the deviant subcultures of
well, how did
drugs.
they break the cycle?
How did they recover?
Yeah.
But to answer that, I have to talk a little bit about the nature of the process of drug dependency. People take drugs because they work. The tragedy of drugs is probably that they work so very well for a short term. No matter what your psychological problem, you can find a drug, if you experiment enough, that will make you feel better. That is why it's impossible to make a rational argument against drug taking to a person who is possibly feeling good for the first time in her life. You cannot say this is going to be ultimately destructive and you must give it up, because they will not listen to you. They feel good. And even though intellectually they know their lives may be falling into ruins around them, they're not going to give up the one thing that makes them feel good. So what has to happen is that somehow the drugs have to stop working. And you have to reach the point where no matter what drug you try, it won't work either. And that's what happened to these women. The drugs simply stopped working. I think, in a sense, that happened because despair is cumulative, and every day that you avoid facing a problem, it gets worse, and the pain increases. I'm sure there's some geometric progression of despair. So that, as the Abigail interview shows, that even sustained heroin use is not strong enough to work anymore. And that's what happened to these women. However, if that's all that happens, you most likely lose a drug-addicted person. They become psychotic, they commit suicide, they take so many drugs, there's such a bizarre combination of drugs that they contract some drug-related illness, generally fatal. But if, like these women, something good is happening, then when the drugs stop working, it's not so painful, you can live through it. And what happened to these women was that all of them came to understand that even though they could not be traditional women, even though they would never be good wives and mothers, there was something else that they could do in the world that was fulfilling and important. I mean, they're middle-class women who grew up with very strong concepts of social and personal responsibility. The belief that that one owes a debt that one has to pay off in life, that you have to do a certain amount of good in order to survive. And they found that, I think maybe one of the strongest stories is the story of Kathleen, who took drugs for years. And it wasn't until she became a social worker and suddenly found herself responsible for 120 disadvantaged families that she suddenly began to feel important, needed, fulfilled. And it just so happened that it was at that time that the drugs stopped working. And she came out of it, and stronger at the broken place. But that doesn't happen to all women, unfortunately. It happened to the women in my book, only because that was the kind of woman I sought out.
Well, was I wrong to be encouraged by the cure rate in your book? I mean, is it really higher than we're led to believe? Or?
Well, it certainly is for middle-class women. Middle-class people have a lot of options that the disadvantaged class don't have. These women were well educated, they were bright, they know how society works. And when they have managed by their drug-induced behavior to offend everyone around them, they simply picked up and moved. You know, they're mobile, they can move to another town, they can move to a different social group. And they can also pick up and leave their drugs behind. They can move out of the drug world. You don't find that in the disadvantaged class. You find people stuck, you know, in their very small, deprived world. But it's not true of the middle class. And I think the recovery rate for alcoholism and narcotics addiction may be as high as 35 or 40% among middle class women. So yes, it's much higher.
It is much higher.
Yeah.
You think that a lot of drug programs are not carried out for the benefit of the drug-dependent person. Would you care to elaborate about that? Whose benefit are they carried out for then?
They're carried out for the benefit of the people who fund and who are supported economically by the programs. The programs are particularly bad for women in that they are male-dominated, and while we have come to recognize the extent of female addiction and female alcoholism, we have yet to do anything about it. That is to say, we've updated our figures now, and we no longer say that 1 out of 10 addicts or alcoholics are women. We now say 1 out of 2 are women. But the programs are not geared toward the woman addict or the woman alcoholic.
Are there none?
No. They operate largely without funds. You cannot find them. I mean, if you go to a state program, a federally funded program, what you're going to find is a male-dominated program that more often than not will be staffed by former drug takers, and which it's simply a way to put the ex-drug taker to work. It doesn't really move him out of the world of drugs. It just simply gives him a job, and I say him because they're almost all male. While women join federal drug programs at almost the same rate as men do, they drop out 4 times more often because there are no feminist therapists. There is no job counseling directed toward women. I think in large part that that the federal government ought to stop 90% of the drug funding that it does now, enforcement, education, and rehabilitative efforts, because they do no good.
When you said feminist therapist, it kicked off something that I remember reading in the book that I was very interested in discussing with you. You say that there are similarities between the drug culture and the feminist movement.
I say specifically that you can make a correlation between the drug-dependent woman and a fanatical feminist, which is kind of different than saying I think that drug-taking and feminism are the same. I do believe that's true, and I think for proof all you have to do is look at some of the women that are prominent in the movement, and you find them exhibiting the same personality characteristics that the women in my book exhibit when they're strung out on drugs. That is, they're hostile, they're self-serving, they manipulate others around them. But I don't want that to suggest that I'm very negative about the movement. I'm not. I'm very strong on the feminist movement. I think the problem is that if you take a desperate woman, no matter what you give her, whether it be drugs or feminism or religion or politics, she's going to make something out of it that's ugly. You know, that what she turns to is ultimately going to victimize her rather than save her. And it's not until women resolve their psychological problems that they can come to any kind of movement, be it, you know, religious or political or social, and make sense out of it. I know that for drugs to work, for feminism to work, for religion to work, there's a certain sense in which faith is all important. You have to believe. The women in my book believed very strongly that drugs would be their salvation. Drugs were not for them essentially a part of the problem. They were a part of the solution. None of them took drugs to make herself feel worse. She turned to drugs to make herself feel better. And it is only after the fact, and because of the nature of the women involved, that the drugs victimize them. You know, 90% of the people who take drugs walk away from them unharmed. You know, the drugs do not do in most people, but they do in desperate people. And all I'm saying in the book is that anything does in a desperate person. If you put a desperate person into religion, you're going to have a religious fanatic.
I think you used the example of chocolate cake.
You know, if you take a desperate woman and put her into politics, you're going to have the SLA. And it's just that drugs have to be seen as simply one of a series of desperate solutions.
We have 30 seconds.
All right.
I'm sorry I didn't warn you before. I'd like to know what you wanted to say with the book. What's the most important thing?
Perhaps that, that despite the generalizations that we make about middle-class drug taking, middle-class women are, each of them, unique and individual. Their problems are individual, their solutions are individual. And that the women I talked to survived because they came to terms with themselves and with the parts of them that caused them problems, but which made them very special.
Barbara, thank you very much. We're out of time. Thank you for watching. See you next week.